Welcome explorers today. Dive into this thrilling TTP narration of Ghosts in the Avalanche by Banancake, an ongoing fan-made book from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time May 20th 2137. Chapter 11, Angels. I just wanted to lay where I was forever. The snow was, oddly warm. Welcoming. It felt as though with every passing minute as the wind pelted the fur on my back, I was slowly sinking into the white abyss. My eyes were shut as I began to slip into an eerie sense of tranquility. I was tired. So tired. Yet despite the peace that was slowly dragging me to my demise, I knew it was all a trick. It would be easy to surrender, to drift quietly into one final slumber. But there were people waiting for me. My eyes wearily fluttered open, and the sun overwhelmed my vision, drowning the scenery around me in golden light. The first sight I was greeted with when my eyes finally adjusted was a flower, swaying gently in the wind a few inches from where my face was planted in the snow. Water dripped off of its vibrant blue petals as the sun began to melt the frost claiming them. I inhaled an icy breath that burned like fire in my lungs. I wheezed as I strained to push my body up and out of the snow with my arms. They trembled weakly before I managed to lift myself to my knees. My fur hung over my face slightly as it too began to drip with freshly melted snow and frost. I shivered as I sat there with my head hung before looking over at the beautiful nightflower. Its presence here could only mean one thing. I brushed my fur out of my eyes as I shakily stood up and leaned against a nearby tree. My eyes widened slightly as I looked down into the valley beneath me and saw a fire consuming the forest. The remnants of a ship were scattered all over the valley, burning as they sent monuments of smoke and ash high into the air. I tucked my paws under my arms as I surveyed my surroundings. In every direction as far as my eyes could see, the terrain was the same: hills, valleys, and trees. Aside from the roaring fire beneath me and the sound of the pines rustling in the wind, the forest was completely silent. No wildlife moved within the trees. It was a place frozen in time, in a place nothing could reach. A place without end. And it was all in my head. What I did next I couldn't explain. I knew this was a dream. I knew that, logically, there was no possible way I could die here. I could stay in this debris field as long as I'd like, maybe even keep warm by the fires burning in the valley beneath me. I could even lie down and surrender to the snow's embrace, and I'd wake up on a warm hospital bed with friends and family ready to welcome me back. Despite this, I started walking. Slowly, at first, but I eventually found my stride through the deep snow and between the trees, struggling up a hill only to fumble down the other side, leaning on the tall alpines as I went. How long this continued was unknowable, but eventually I found myself far from where I once was, the only indication of how far I'd gone being the pillars of smoke rising on the horizon behind me. It was at this point that the dream began to feel very real. As I began descending yet another hill, I lost my footing and gravity took its unforgiving hold as I began tumbling down the incline. Every attempt I made to stop myself failed, and the trees that had once supported me now battered me as I rolled into them on my way down. Finally, I reached the valley's lowest point and came to a stop in the snow, once again lying face down. The cold now felt far less comforting as clouds began to roll in and seal out the radiant warmth of the sun. My legs and feet were entirely numb. I grabbed my wrist and attempted to curl my digits, but they were frozen as well, swollen to the point that moving them at all was nearly impossible. Fuck, I wheezed weakly. I drowsily lifted myself out of the snow once again. I could feel my muscles tensing up as I shivered relentlessly. Every one of my limbs burned with icy soreness as the cold seemed to grip my bones themselves. I knew that if I didn't get warm soon, I'd die. Perhaps I should have stayed at the crash site, where there was no shortage of fire. I'll make my own damn fire. I stumbled to my feet and held my side as I limped further into the forest. I found a fallen tree not far from where I lay. Its leaves were dead and dried by the relentless winds. I frantically gathered a fistful of needles and cleared out a space in the snow. I gathered sticks, hoping they were dry enough to burn. I gathered up a pile of rocks, hoping that at least one of them could generate a spark. And so I leaned over this pile of dead plants in the middle of an endless, frozen forest, and struck rocks together. Again. And again. And again. It wasn't working. The dread of freezing to death grew into blind desperation with every strike. I inhaled through my teeth as I shivered. Come on, again. Nothing. Come on. Again. The faintest spark, but still nothing. Tears flowed down my face. Damn it, light. Again. A piece of one of the rocks chipped away entirely, flying into the trees, but I still had no fire. This went on for agonizing minutes as every strike became weaker and weaker. All sensation left my paws. I couldn't even hold the rocks anymore, much less strike them together. I wheezed as I attempted one last time, knocking both stones out of my paws and collapsing onto my hands and knees. Desperation was replaced with defeat as I stared blankly down at the pile of kindling. I could feel the cold claiming me, the life draining from my body little by little as the shivering ceased all at once. I could do nothing but fall over in the snow as tears froze on my face. All awareness that this was only a dream was gone. This was it. This was the end. Even if somehow I survived, I'd never escape this forest in this state. All I could do was curl up and weep as I waited for my demise. I felt a flurry of both grief and anger as I pulled my legs into my chest, my breath hitching as I sobbed through clenched teeth. The cold seeped into my flesh piece by piece until I could hardly move. I wanted to get up and fight, maybe one more try would start a fire, but no matter how much determination I tried to summon, my body simply wouldn't respond. I was helpless. Alone. My sobbing was abruptly interrupted as I felt something touch me, something behind me. Immediately, I froze, afraid to look at whatever it was. This entire time I'd seen no life in this forest other than me. As I lay there, frozen in terror, I felt a sudden surge of warmth as someone or something wrapped a sheet of fabric over me. I felt human hands tuck it tightly around my shoulders. I shakily looked down and saw my poncho wrapped around me. The red silhouettes of earth fauna glistened with life as if they might start moving, entirely untouched by the snow and ice. I saw a long shadow creep over the snow as the figure it belonged to crouched down over my improvised fireplace. A large pair of hands reached down and picked up the rocks I was using before. With just a couple of aggressive strikes, a spark ignited the kindling, and the fire quickly grew, consuming the sticks and branches placed on top of it. Immediately, I felt radiant warmth begin returning to my body. I sat up, and though the vicious cold had been expelled from my body, my heart froze as I looked up at the human. "Come on, Vic," Tenga breathed, smiling gently. "One more hill." My eyes slowly opened, moist with tears. I was greeted with the sight of the nightflower next to my bed before I stirred and rolled onto my back. Placed over me, on top of the sheets, was my poncho. I slowly reached down and grabbed the soft fabric and lifted it in front of my face. Suddenly, I heard Vivri's voice from the other side of the room. "I thought you'd like to have it here," she said drowsily. I looked over and saw her wrapped up in a blanket sitting in a recliner near my bed. I sat upright, stunned for a moment before I quickly reached up and wiped my eyes. "Yeah. Thank you." Vivri stirred as she propped up her head on the armrest. "You seem to do a lot better than last night while I was here," she whispered. "No fever or anything. But you cried a lot." I scoffed. "Yeah, I can tell," I breathed, rubbing my dampened face. "The dreams are really intense. Did something bad happen?" "Something good happened." Vivri straightened slightly. "So, it was a good dream?" I chuckled. No, not at all. I actually thought I was going to die, but I ran a paw over the hand-woven fabric across my lap. But I finally know there is someone in my head looking out for me." "Someone?" Vivri asked, perplexed. Andy suddenly crossed through the open threshold, carrying an assortment of bags and boxes in her arms. "Oh good, you're awake," she said, setting the boxes down on a nearby counter. She sifted through the items as she spoke. "I brought some stuff. This hospital's food is bad for your mental health on its own, so I brought you guys a bunch of fruits and veggies. Don't worry, I cleared all of it with the doc." "Did you?" "Yes," Andy snickered, "I brought you some." She took a clear container of sliced watermelons and tossed them Vivri's way. Vivri squeaked excitedly as it landed in her lap. I laughed as she practically tore the container open. Andy smiled as she walked over and knelt beside my bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I think," I replied, running a paw over the poncho. Andy scrunched up her face slightly. I think isn't good enough." I laughed. "Okay, I know. You better, I think isn't gonna be good enough for Rainer either," she said, gesturing toward the doorway with her eyes. "You said Rainer was your therapist too. How long were you seeing him?" I asked. "After all of that? I've been seeing him once a month ever since. But at first, I was kinda in the same position as you." She looked down slightly and scratched the side of her neck as she spoke. "For different reasons though." My ears flattened slightly. "What happened?" I asked before quickly adding, "If you're alright with, you know." Andy snickered as she smiled at me. "It's okay, Fluff. I already told you most of it." She inhaled. I had a pretty serious problem related to all of that trauma. Whenever all of that stuff started coming up in my head, I would just start driving, trying to get my mind off of it. Problem is, it rarely ever worked." She propped herself up with her hands as she hoisted herself off her knees and sat against the wall next to me, only her head and shoulders visible over the edge of my bed. She pulled her knees close and placed an elbow on them, propping up her head by the chin, before she continued. "It went from just going on a ride to try and clear my head to blazing at over 100 down a dirt road. I don't know why exactly. I guess it was just cathartic, in a way. That went on for a while until one night, I was having these horrible nightmares. Couldn't sleep, so I did what I'd usually do and hopped in my car. This time was different though. That catharsis never came. Instead, the emotions just intensified. I just totally lost it. Before I knew it, I was maxing out the speedometer on a crowded highway, screaming at the top of my lungs. Could hardly see through the tears." Andy choked slightly as she held her legs close to her chest. Behind her, I could see Vivri listening closely as she sat upright, her ears flattened with a half-eaten watermelon slice held close to her chest. Thankfully, a patrolman pulled me over. "Officer Galvin, we still talk occasionally." All the sirens and lights seemed to bring me out of it. When he got me out of the car and saw the state I was in, he could tell this wasn't the typical case of a delinquent on a joyride. He took me to the station, locked me up for the night, and my dad came for me in the morning. Rather than throw me in jail, they sent me to a therapist. That's how I met Rainer. If Galvin hadn't stopped me, I could've, she inhaled sharply. Could've ended up either killing myself or someone else. Maybe both. Andy rubbed her hands together. "But I don't do that anymore. Turns out there are better ways to manage your emotions," she chuckled. "If Rainer could help me, I'm confident he can help you. You just have to lay it all out." "Yeah. That part is quite new for me," I muttered. "It gets easier," Andy assured me, grabbing my wrist. "Can't be much worse than me," she laughed. I was a menace to Rainer's tissue boxes. I laughed with her, in awe of her. As I continued learning more and more about her, I was realizing that she was living, breathing proof that I could make it. She was transforming what my idea of a strong person really was. Not someone who's never vulnerable, but someone who doesn't fear being vulnerable. "Oh." Andy suddenly let go of my wrist. "Sorry, I got so caught up in all this talk that I almost forgot." She pulled out her phone and swiped through it for a moment before handing it to me. A video was playing on the screen. I saw a person's feet as they walked down a hallway before the camera rotated up as a human hand opened what looked like a chain-linked gate. With a click and a slight creak, the gate opened to reveal Lucky on a large dog bed. Her head raised up as the person entered. "Hi, big girl," a female voice said excitedly. Immediately, a hefty thumping followed as Lucky's tail began to wag as she looked up at the human. As the camera approached closer, I could see her front right leg bound in a brace. A large patch of fur was missing from around her shoulder, mostly covered by gauze and medical tape. Lucky excitedly leaned into the human's hand as she reached down to pet her, never moving from the bed. "Lucky is doing great," the voice stated. "Her oxygen is back to normal, the fluid in her lung is pretty much gone." The entire time she spoke, she maintained the same cheery tone of voice as she continued to pet Lucky. "No infections so far, and she's just such a polite young lady," she said, rubbing the top of her head, which was met with even more thumps from her tail against the floor. The human giggled. "She'll be good to go in no time." The video ended abruptly, frozen on a goofy frame of Lucky's face as she licked the vet's hand. It lasted all of 30 seconds. It wouldn't have mattered if it had continued, however. By that point, I could hardly see the screen. I was overwhelmed with a tumultuous mixture of both guilt and immense happiness to actually see her alive and on the mend. I wiped my face as I handed the phone back to Andy, who was smiling slightly, though her face expressed a hint of sympathy. "I thought you might like to see for yourself that she's okay." "Yeah, thanks." I took a deep breath. I stared off into nothingness for a few seconds. Do you think she'll be afraid of me?" I asked shakily. Andy shook her head. "I doubt it," she breathed. "I mean, I don't know a whole lot about dogs, and I guess it's possible, but, I don't know, you saw how happy she seemed in that video." "She was with humans," I quickly pointed out. Andy hung her head for a moment. "I guess you've got a point. But, remember when you told me that story about how she broke your leg?" She looked at me, a gesture which I returned as I turned an eye toward her. Andy nodded her head forward slightly. "You weren't afraid of her after that, right?" "No, but..." "Because you're best friends, partners, you know she wouldn't hurt you intentionally," she interrupted. "I think she knows you wouldn't hurt her on purpose either." It wasn't so simple. I practically looked her in the eyes while I did it. Lucky was incredibly smart, but I doubted she would understand that I wasn't in my right mind at that moment. I opened my mouth to speak, but quickly shut it again. Lucky has always known when I'm in a bad state of mind, often before I did. Maybe it wasn't so outlandish to think that maybe she considered this another one of those instances. "Maybe you're right," I muttered. "I hope you are. For now, let's focus on making sure that never happens again," Andy said, her eyes glaring up at me as she tilted her head forward. I was startled slightly by a soft knocking at the threshold. I looked up to see Rainer standing there in a white dress shirt, coffee mug in hand. "Let's," he said, smiling. "Meet me in my office as soon as you can, Vickery." The office seemed entirely unchanged since yesterday. Every object was in the same place, save for the black suit jacket folded over the armrest of Rainer's chair. He sat down and crossed his legs, flipping through a few pages of his notebook as he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. The clock on the wall continued its merciless march, and the glass of water in front of me hosted a reflection of my face on its surface. My appearance was without expression, complementing the taste of the water as I put the glass to my lips. It betrayed no image of the endless, frozen forest behind my own eyes, something I'd seen twice now in my dreams. Such a thing was expressionless, only perceivable by my own subconscious, and, even then, still hardly comprehensible. Even now, my memory of it all felt bizarre. Rainer, however, seemed as confident as ever, even smiling slightly as he lifted a cup of coffee to his mouth. He seemed certain that he could guide me through my own mind, certain to the point that one would think he'd found physical evidence that he could. In a way, he did. Andy, as I continued to learn, was in the same state as me, sitting in this same room. Now, she seemed genuinely happy. It was clear that her experiences still haunted her, but she seemed to have them tamed. She could retell her experiences almost effortlessly, not as an active fighter, but as a victor. Maybe Raynor was right to be so confident. Maybe, for better or worse, nothing is expressionless, and everything ends. How do you feel, Vickery? Raynor carefully placed the coffee cup back on the small table next to him. I followed suit and set my glass of water down. I feel rested, at least. I heard there weren't as many complications this time. Raynor shook his head. Nope. You hardly moved all night. He leaned forward. Any more nightmares? Yes, well this was different, I stuttered, still struggling to recall the dream entirely. I was in this forest again, I think it was the exact same one as before. Mostly, I just remember walking. I didn't seem to be going anywhere, though. At one point I was sure I'd freeze to death, but Tenga showed up out of nowhere. He saved me. Raynor crossed his legs and wrote something down on his notepad. Interesting. Has he ever appeared in your dreams before? No, not that I can remember. Raynor finished writing and looked back up at me. Well, that's something positive happening in your dreams, perhaps a small sign of improvement. And the sedative is continuing to work at half the previous dosage. He took another sip of coffee. So let's keep doing what gets results. Today, we'll be doing the same thing as yesterday, getting your story off your chest. He set the cup down, making eye contact with me. I'd like you to start from your first memory after landing on Earth. Take it at your own pace. It was difficult to say for sure what my first memory after landing actually was. After I blacked out in the escape pod, I must have been fading in and out of consciousness, because my memory of the first day consisted of mere glimpses. A blue sky, a snowy forest, birds fleeing the trees. My first clear memory was waking up to the sound of Tenga's rushing footsteps in the snow as he carried me on his back, covered with the blanket. He called out to someone. A voice called back. Looking back, I realized it was Grant. I need a med kit, now. My next memory after that was waking up next to a fire, my head bound in bandages. I'd been wrapped in several layers of reflective emergency blankets. Vic? Tenga's face appeared in front of me, gently illuminated by the firelight. Can you hear me? Am I dying? Was the first question out of my mouth. No, Tenga answered assuringly. You'll be fine. Just a head injury. The humans suddenly scrambled to their feet at the sound of something running toward them. I managed to roll over enough to see Querek stumbling out of the brush. As quickly as he fell out, he threw himself back in. Whoa! Don't shoot, I'm on your side. He'd been hunkered down near a burning shipwreck for days before he saw the smoke from our fire. And with that, our pack of 5 was formed. For 9 days afterward, our days consisted of trudging through the mountains, trying to find a safe passage down to level ground. Every day, Reese sent the same message on the emergency radio, and every day, there was no reply. The peaks were desolate. The most wildlife we saw while we were there were birds. It seemed like nature itself was hiding from the destruction still raining from above. Roughly 4 days in, I could walk on my own again. Though we never encountered predators, or anything else for that matter, the cold remained a constant and inescapable threat. If for some reason we couldn't start a fire every few hours, death was certain for all of us. On day 9, the humans' rations were dried up completely, I explained to Raynor, once again staring down at my reflection in the water. So they needed to hunt for food. We went with them. The rest is history. Raynor nodded. I understand you were attacked by wolves during that time. Yeah, I breathed.